So without further ado, I would now like to invite David to talk on tracking spies, Hanslope and the World War II Radio Security Service.
Thank you, Ian, and welcome everybody, and thank you for giving up your Wednesday evening when you should be tucking into your lunch dinner. As Ian alluded to, I've recently written a book about the Radio Security Service, and the genesis of that was actually from the first book, which was Vanguard, because I covered the story of this very poorly known organisation during the Second World War. And very much the focus of a lot of the knowledge in the broader public arena of Second World War SIGINT, Signals Intelligence, is on Bletchley Park and the code breaking or crypt analysis centre there, which was really the hub of a lot of the important aspects of SIGINT. But the story of the broader SIGINT picture is much bigger. There were tens of thousands of people employed, not just in Britain, but overseas as well. And the reason I wrote the book was because certainly this particular unit, which grew to 3,500 people at the height of the war, is so poorly known, and I didn't really know much about it myself. So it really uncovered this fairly unique story. And I've decided to put some Northern Lights in the background, and with my dulcet Yorkshire tones, I'll hopefully send you into some fairly unique dream state over the course of the next 45 minutes, so bear with me. So if you flick to the next slide. Many of you know the origins of wireless technology, radio technology, at the end of the 20th century, the beginning of the 21st century, the work of Marconi and other pioneers. And really, the genesis of signals intelligence, or SIGINT, really spans back to the First World War and the ability of the Allies to intercept German transmissions, radio transmissions, both on the Western Front and in Britain against the German High Seas Fleet in the North Sea. And certainly this graphic in front of you is just essentially a DF plot, a direction finding plot from some of the stations in Britain, plotting the movement of German Zeppelins coming across the North Sea to bomb various parts of Britain. Really, we'll talk a bit about radio technology, we'll talk a bit about direction finding, or DF, but I first want to talk about the development of the Radio Security Service, what it was, how it became to be. So the beginning of the First World War, a lot of the licensed and unlicensed stations in use in Britain, so radio hams all over the country who had licenses, were actually closed down because of the Defence of the Realm Act in August 1914. And a month later, the government were obviously concerned about German agents operating in Britain and carrying out espionage. And September 1914, an interdepartmental committee considered what the best approach would be to detect illicit wireless transmissions from these German agents, transmitting reports, information back to the German homeland. But it really didn't take off. But signals intelligence, the intercept and direction finding aspects, really moved forward massively during the First World War. Number of listening stations by October 1914, and in 1915, the Secretary of the Wireless Society of London, which became the forerunner of what's now known as the Radio Society for Great Britain, Rennie Klein, wrote to the Times newspaper suggesting members should be recruited to monitor the airwaves for illicit wireless transmission. So the genesis of the idea of using radio hams, radio amateurs, or volunteers to detect illicit wireless does go back to around 1914, 1915. But there was no active use of radio amateurs during the First World War. Years later, 1928, an interdepartmental subcommittee from the Committee of Imperial Defence recommended the War Office should use radio amateurs for a future role if we ever went to war. And obviously signals intelligence after the First World War was really embedded. A lot of the Y service units around the country, by certainly the Royal Navy in places like Scarborough, and the Army at places like Chatham, maintain those capabilities during peacetime in the interwar period. And the Government Code and Cipher School, which was formed in 1919, was really owning that space on decrypting and deciphering encrypted communications. If you just jump to the next slide, a chap called Lieutenant Colonel Adrian Simpson, who's a chap on the top right there, he wrote a fairly seminal paper about illicit wireless intercept. And you can see the front cover it there, and really detailed a lot of the techniques and issues around wireless propagation and the limitations of it. He was a former deputy managing director of Marconi, and certainly had a lot of intercept experience during the First World War. And he proposed this entire network of operators in Britain to collect and to work against German transmissions. He also suggested a technical advisory committee that would oversee things like priorities and requirements, and it led to a cross-agency, cross-government committee set up, which was called RSIC, or RSIC, the Radio Security Intelligence Committee, being created. And that was certainly one of the few government committees I've ever come across in my lifetime that was actually useful, and was very, very productive in what it did. The graphic on the left there really just shows the plan that Simpson had of how they would structure and organise these radio amateurs around the country, and split the country into various zones. And eventually it led to the Radio Security Service being formed. So we'll just jump to the next slide. And we all like an organisational chart, so I thought I'd throw one up. Interestingly, the logo on the left there was developed by a chap called Doug Charman, who was one of the more senior Radio Security Service engineers at Hanslope. And I just love that logo. It wasn't officially adopted, but the Latin reads, "Work conquers all, the fox shall not escape." The fox being the German military intelligence service, or the Abwehr, which was the main target for the Radio Security Service. So there was a definite structure around the Radio Security Service. It's evolved during the Second World War, but it did take years to evolve. The Post Office agreed in December 1937 to establish 3 fixed intercept and direction finding stations. But it wasn't, the first station wasn't operational until a year later in 1938. But certainly the early stages of the Radio Security Service as an organisation was heavily interwoven and defined by its relationship with the Post Office. So if we just flick to the next slide. One of the main subgroups of the RSS was what's known as the signals group, and we'll go into a bit of detail on what you've got in front of you there. The various stations or fixed stations around the country that were involved with the interception of German transmissions and direction finding on those transmissions, but also the groups and regions of voluntary interceptors and mobile units that were deployed for that sort of last mile. And so the basis was really of the organisation was this Post Office infrastructure. So flick to the next slide. So this was a nationwide, what they referred to as a teleconference network that was already in place. And essentially the infrastructure was there, and the basis of this RSS network to share rapidly information between these stations, which could take minutes to relay information and to get multiple direction finding stations to fix on a radio transmission. Very, very well organised of its time. So the organisation was first located in C Wing of Wormwood Scrubs Prison in West London, where MI5 had relocated to because of the Blitz, and it was linked by teleprinter to Bletchley Park. Originally, the organisation was part of MI8, MI8c as it was designated. MI8 was the military intelligence organisation, of which there were a number during the Second World War, I think up to 19 different structures. But in 1941, the organisation, which was originally referred to as the Illicit Wireless Intercept Organisation, which sort of gave the game away, was renamed the Radio Security Service, and in 1941 it became part of the Secret Intelligence Service, or MI6, specifically Section 8. So flick to the next slide. And one of the most important components of the organisation were the Voluntary Interceptors. Many of you may have heard this phrase before, or VIs. There were roughly 1,500 to 2,000 of these individuals who'd been specially recruited very, very secretly to work at home, in their attics, in their sheds. It was very, very Dad's army, and they were really, the organisation of it was due to a guy called Ralph Mansfield, or Lord Jimmy Sandhurst, as he was also known as, to create a nationwide network of specialists to get in to what they referred to as the high frequency ground wave. So they had to be distributed around the country every 10 to 15 miles. And he'd written a specific memo to the director of MI5 in October 1938 to ask for the Radio Society of Great Britain, the RSGB, to begin recruiting its members. And they very much formed the backbone of the radio monitors required for the new service. And they were essentially split into 9 regions and were run by a regional officer who would typically have 200 to 400 VIs in each region. And the lady in the top left there is Helena Crawley, who recently died. Unfortunately, I think she was 103 when she died. She was posted with her husband Leslie, and they were both keen radio amateurs, and were deployed up to Orkney, of all places, as far north as you can get. He was actually working as an engineer on one of the airfields, so they had specific cover. But during the day, Helena would work on her wireless sets, receiving transmissions from Scandinavia, so the German intelligence networks operating in Scandinavia, particularly Norway. So the individuals who were working for the organisation, these radio amateurs, were specifically vetted by the local police, and they were given often Royal Observer Corps or Royal Signals uniforms. So the chap in the middle there is Roy Fortley. And specifically, they had to contribute more than 48 hours per month to avoid home guard or fire watch duties. But many of them did a lot more than that, some of which contributed over 160 hours. So bear in mind, a lot of these amateurs actually worked full time as well. So they'd spend their evenings and their nights listening to their wireless. Essentially, there were 3 grades of Morse operator. The best ones were graded as A, who could do 23 words per minute and more. Grade B, who could do 20 words per minute, and grade C, who could do 18 words per minute. And a fairly interesting statistic, the first 50 voluntary interceptors who were recruited identified over 600 German agents operating in occupied Europe. The basis of their work was to listen to a set frequency on their receiver sets, or to look at a radio frequency band to look out for specific activity on that radio frequency band. They would fill in log sheets. You can see an example of a log sheet on the right there. And they were filled in every day. And they were sent by post to a fairly anonymous postal address, which was referred to as PO Box 25. So the log sheets were put into double envelopes and sent by post. Many of the radio operators had no idea where that location was or what was done with the information. I will talk about the follow-on part of that later. The logs would often come back with comments marked on them. You can see a few on that example there. They're often marked in red crayon, just like you were at school, with comments such as "watch please," "okay," "covered thanks," very heavy atmospherics, etc., and "more please." And it essentially gave them a guide as to what to look for, what to repeat. If they were onto what they think was an intelligence network, they would make sure they got the VIs back on point. And the VIs were responsible to those regional officers, and it was their duty to regularly meet with their voluntary interceptors. And it was often in the back room of a pub. And many of the amateurs knew each other because it was an activity out of war where they knew each other, and they would share knowledge on what they were doing. Obviously, they were very, very tight-lipped with anybody else. It was very much need to know what they were doing. There was often cases of individuals with aerials sticking out of their roofs, their attics, which would raise suspicions from the local population. And the police would turn up on their doorstep, but they would typically have a get out of jail free card. By 1941, the logs were flooding into PO Box 25, and at a point they were getting 10,000 pages per day, just to give you an idea of the scale of the efforts across the country. We flick to the next slide. I just wanted to highlight one specific voluntary interceptor who I came across fairly recently. Unfortunately, after all the details were certainly bubbled up after I'd done the book. A chap called Edward Bridge. Ironically, in the midst of COVID restrictions last year, the local council, where he lived in a little village called Burscough in Lancashire, unveiled a blue plaque, and you can see that in the picture there. He was actually awarded a military medal during the First World War. He captured a German machine gun post during the Somme battle when he was with the King's Liverpool Regiment. After that, he was severely injured and came home. And the severe injuries that he'd got during the First World War left him bedridden. Completely bedridden, and he developed an interest in radios and taught himself Morse code. He got his wireless license, and he was subsequently enlisted into the Radio Security Service. And through his work against a group of an Abwehr network, which was operating in New Jersey in America, under a double agent called William Siebold. Now, there was a German agent in the group called Fritz Duquesne, who was running 33 agents, which became known as the Duquesne spy ring. And the Radio Security Service, specifically Edward Bridge, and the FBI were monitoring this network, which showed Abwehr activity not just in North America, but also in South America and in Mexico. The FBI disrupted the network in June 1941. And in the trial in the Federal District Court in Brooklyn in New York, which began on the 3rd of September 1941, the 33 members of the network were given over 300 years in prison. And you can see a picture, a graphic there on the right of the individuals involved. The leader of the group, Duquesne, was himself given 18 years in prison. And to this date, it's the biggest espionage case in American history that's ended in a conviction. The British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, wrote to Bridge personally, and I quote, "I was stirred to hear of your splendid war work. You have not allowed physical disability to prevent you playing a fine part in the fight against Nazi Germany. May I send you all good wishes and my warmest congratulations upon your success." He was subsequently awarded the British Empire Medal, the BEM, and unfortunately died in 1943 before he was invested with the medal. So the RSS, the Radio Security Service, was integral to monitoring the German intelligence services. And many of you know the story of the MI5 double cross story of the Second World War. MI5 were recruiting agents coming into Britain and were turning them, and the Radio Security Service was fundamental in helping identify those agents, but also giving them knowledge of when they were going to arrive in Britain for MI5 And latterly, during the double cross program, as that started to mature, the Radio Security Service was fundamental in giving the British intelligence community an understanding of how far the disinformation was spreading in German intelligence. So among the first 21 spies to arrive in September 1940, 4 of them came in by dinghy, 2 by parachute, and some by fishing boat. Several arrived among the large number of genuine refugees who were flooding in during the German occupation of occupied Western Europe. But not all of these arrivals were enthusiastic, not all of them were very competent. In fact, some gave themselves up as soon as possible, some were easily caught because of their ineptitude, but few came without the prior knowledge because of the radio transmissions intercept made by the Radio Security Service. Out of all the illicit entries, nearly 30 of them were made into double agents working on our behalf, unknown to the Germans. And they were given cover names, and at least 4, certainly of massive value: Tate, Zigzag, Tricycle, and Garbo were of great value, especially Garbo in the run-up to D-Day. And I'm sure some of you have read the Ben McIntyre books. There was another Agent Snow, who was very important in the early days of the Radio Security Service when it was working in close cooperation with MI5. We just flick to the next slide. So I mentioned PO Box 25. Well, this was the location. It's a place called Oakley View, which is just outside Barnet in North London, which was opened on the 3rd of October 1940, and you can see it's just under construction there. It was very much the operational and administrative hub for the organisation. The Intercept reports, the log sheets, which we've just been talking about, were sent here, and it was very much an industrial process. Most of the content was from Abwehr Handcipher. Oakley was run by Lieutenant Colonel Kenneth Morton Evans, who was regarded as the Deputy Controller for the RSS. He was originally a company commander with 4th Battalion, the Welsh Regiment, and his course of the war was to fatefully change after eating a Pembrokeshire sausage, which infected him with trichinosis. And on his sick leave in spring 1940, he was returning from his medical board on the train and met Captain Edward Vale, who was the regional officer for the RSS in Wales, who encouraged him to join the RSS, and he had a very seismic rise in terms of promotion, and quickly became very significant. If you flick to the next slide. So we talked a bit about Intercept, and one of the other components of the Radio Security Service, which is important to talk about, is their skill at traffic analysis. It was also a speciality of another part of the SIGINT picture, which was the Sixter team at Bletchley Park under leaders like Gordon Welshman. Very important part of SIGINT. You're not dealing with content here. You're looking at the wrapper around the transmission. You're looking at the call signs and the preambles. But it allowed you to build up the picture. And essentially what the RSS structured itself around in terms of its resources, in terms of collection and direction finding, was around groups. They called them groups. And each was ostensibly a radio network controlled out of a hub. And the study of each group was the responsibility of a group officer who would reconstruct the signals plans of the communications networks using direction finding and other sources to discover locations. So group 1 was called Harry. This was an Abwehr network controlled from Hamburg. Harry, Hamburg, you can see the pattern. The networks in this group were usually long-distance radio links with clandestine agents operating overseas as far afield as South America, the States, Angola, and Mozambique. Group 2 was called Bertie, or Berlin. You can see the network on the left-hand side. This was, again, another Abwehr station operating in Berlin, and it was most certainly the most significant of all the groups. The network had linkages and subcenters across occupied Europe as far afield as Poland, Norway, and Spain, which routed daily information back to the hub in Berlin. But there were a number of other groups. Group 12, for example, focused on Russian clandestine transmissions. Group 9 focused on Palestine traffic, so it wasn't just focused on German intelligence service traffic. One of the most important parts of the radio security service, and indeed the most secret, was the radio intelligence section, or the RIS, led by Hugh Trevor Roper. Again, was located in Oakley View in the headquarters. And Trevor Roper worked alongside Charles Stewart, Stuart Hampshire, Gilbert Ryle, who all would go on to become Oxbridge professors. They would be the recipients of the decrypts from the Government Code and Cipher School at Bletchley. But they'd also get other source material on specific radio nets that the RSS was covering. So their role was ostensibly to receive, maintain, and to publish target knowledge on enemy intelligence services activity. They were the subject matter experts of German intelligence service operations and activity all around the world. And you can find out some fascinating stuff in the National Archives in some of the files there. They guided priorities for interception and would advise group leaders on what to focus their resources on. In one particular example, Hugh Trevor Roper was working on an Abwehr cipher in his flat in Ealing that he was sharing, and got very excited because they managed to break into the cipher just by hand after a few hours of work. He reported it up to his commanding officer, Colonel Woolledge, who ordered him directly to write a document about how he'd done it, which he gladly did. And he then rather naively circulated to its normal customers with a cover note stating the document had been written by Lieutenant Trevor Roper. Seemed to deserve some form of distribution, but their work would cause an outrage and massive amounts of friction certainly with Bletchley Park. Until it was agreed, the appointment of Oliver Strachey, who was a Bletchley Park cryptanalyst, to bridge the gap and build an effective liaison relationship, which was to last until the end of the Second World War. When the document reached MI6 in London, I quote, "There was an explosion." Recently arrived from the Indian Police Service in Calcutta, Major Felix Cowgill, the new head of the MI6 Counter-Espionage Section, or Section 5, sought a formal court-martial for Trevor Roper. So Colonel Woolledge, his commanding officer, was to receive this reprimand from his superiors in MI8, who had been instructed to by the seniors in MI6. I quote, "We were gravely reprimanded for having deciphered the documents and formally forbidden to do so again, since that was the province of Bletchley Park." If you jump to the next slide. Radio Security Service needed much more than the amateurs. It needed full-time intercept stations. And Hanslope is a very good example of one, that was certainly the biggest. The Radio Security Service took over Hanslope in August 1941. And Captain Reggie Wigg, who's the chap on the right there, was in charge of the advance party, but building work was completed by May 1942. It was very much the engineering and direction finding headquarters. The engineering group was led by one of the world's foremost DF engineers, Major Dick Keane, who previously worked for Marconi, and he was the author of some of the most significant texts in the subject of radio direction finding that are still used to this day. Robin Addy as well, important figure at Hanslope. He was the officer in charge of the engineering section, and the work that they were pioneering there was so advanced of its time, it would become such an important part of the signals intelligence machinery in Britain that the RSS had built. Brigadier Gambier Parry, who was the controller for the RSS, hosted visits from General Eisenhower, Field Marshal Montgomery, and General Alexander towards the end of the war. One of the latter part of the war, there was other things going on at Hanslope. Meanwhile, in close liaison with the British government, the Americans developed a secure speech system which was called Sig Sally, which was an enormous machine which weighed in nearly 50 tons. And the second one that was built was installed in the basement of Selfridges in London's Oxford Street, and it would provide a secure communications link for the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill down to number 10 Downing Street and onwards to the US President Franklin Roosevelt in the White House. The Allied leadership needed something much more portable, and that task was given to the RSS engineers at Hanslope. In 1943, Bletchley's Alan Turing was deployed to Hanslope for a short-term detachment, and he'd lead the design and development for a portable secure speech system which became known as Delilah. Then it followed a visit to the States by a British Joint Staff mission which included Turing, which took place in late 1942, where they'd been taken to the Bell laboratories to see the design of a new US secure speech system in development. So when he was at Hanslope, Turing lived in Shenley Brook End village, and 2 days a week he'd cycle to Hanslope to work on the Delilah system with a small team of specialist engineering staff, which included Don Bailey from the REME, an ATS operator and mathematician called Mary Green, who had done some pioneering work with Major Dick Keane on DF previously, and Robin Gandy, who was another mathematician who had originally come up with the name Delilah. By autumn 1944, Alan Turing was now working full-time at Hanslope on the project because it was so important. The Delilah prototype was ready for the summer of 1945, although it was never used operationally as the war came to a close before it could. But the project was to be the first example of the digitization of voice in the world. We just jump to the next slide. As I mentioned, direction finding was an important part of the operational work of the Radio Security Service. It wasn't just about intercepting the content of a transmission, it was about locating that information, locating that transmitter, and potentially locating that agent and where he was operating from. So the DF program began really in 1938 when the Post Office created 3 new ad hoc DF stations at Sandridge, which is near St Albans, Stockland, which is just outside Bridgewater, and Cupar, which is just north of Edinburgh. It was actually the systems and the stations were built as a peacetime development out of the Post Office's own funds, but it was very much the first RSS radio DF activity. Alongside this existing ad hoc DF system in 1940, a new DF system was being pioneered called Spaced Loop Direction Finder, which had been developed at the National Physical Laboratory, and it had been brought into the RSS by Jerry Openshaw. The central DF plotting control room was in Barnet at Oakley View, and that was under his control. So bearings from these locations could be undertaken from 500 miles distance, just to give you some idea of the capability. The system relied on tanks that were buried in the ground. You can see some of them in transit and being buried in the ground. The basic idea was putting them in the ground, these 8 foot deep and 13 foot wide trenches to accommodate the tanks would screen out any radio interference. And the tank would then be connected to 4 external aerials, which would be linked to rotatable coils called goniometers inside the tank. So these were installed at DF sites in St Earth, Wymondham, Bridgewater, Forfar, Thurso, and at Gilderhirk in Northern Ireland. So Wymondham was a typical DF station. It comprised 8 staff, a sergeant in charge and 7 other ranks. And the team would do 3 8-hour shifts, but with only one operator at a time, actually housed in the metal tank. During the day, there were other people around carrying out routine maintenance, things like running the auxiliary power generators in case the mains failed, checking the calibration of the DF equipment, etc. The night shift was from 2300 to 0700 in the morning and pretty laborious. The operator would be on his own entirely in a tank in the ground with a candle for light. There were also mobile detection units that would be distributed around the country for this last mile DF on illicit signals. And they had really 3 remits: to investigate suspect transmitters from a signal under the instruction of the teams in Oakley View, and they use DF vans and DF units. They maintain listening watches on suspect buildings by setting up stations within a quarter of a mile of the suspect site. And special equipment was used that had been designed by the post office or by the engineering group at Hanslope, which could mechanically mark signals of interest, highlighting frequency and time of transmission. And the third remit was to provide those mobile units. And certainly when the second front was opened up in Normandy in 1944, those mobile units were deployed onto the continent to provide intercept and DF. Go to the next slide, please. One of the other remits for Hanslope was to carry out what we refer to as reverse engineering. After the Allied invasion of France in June 1944, the RSS would give implicit instructions to the field security police of the intelligence corps to make sure any wireless sets they were to come across, particularly those belonging to agents, would be shipped back to Britain and to Hanslope. It was important the RSS could understand their design, their operating ranges and the procedures. And this was under Robin Addy, the chief engineering officer that was responsible for this. And this is just one example from the National Archives. This is a radio set that was confiscated from an agent called Yves Goulicher, who was a stay-behind agent in Normandy, who'd been captured during the Allied advance and was arrested with his equipment. If we jump to the next slide. And one of the things I didn't really know about the RSS until I started writing the book was their activities overseas, and it was very, very extensive. The RSS special sections, as they were known, and they were typically manned by military personnel, were sent as far afield as Tanzania, Gibraltar, Egypt, Malta, Palestine, the British Cameroons. They also had liaison officers with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in Canada, and had a good working relationship with Royal Canadian Signals, and also with the FBI and the US Coast Guard, who were operating off Northwest Africa in the early part of 1945. And just one example here is the Middle East Radio Service, or MERS, which was the RSS facility in Egypt. It was at a military base in a place called Sidi Bashir, which was just east of Alexandria, commanded by Captain Jack Hester, and was formed in February 1941. Alongside Gibraltar, it was the first RSS overseas station. It had 15 intercept positions and looked to prioritize its interception in Italy, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, and the Aegean networks. And I had very, very close liaison with Bletchley's outpost in Cairo, which was called the Combined Bureau Middle East, which was very much the SIGINT hub for the Middle East. The collection here and the logs were transmitted back to a facility in Wadden, which is just down the road from Bletchley Park, which was where SAS Section 8 had a SIGINT facility known as Windy Ridge. The MERS also had detachments which would deploy along the North African coast with the ebb and flow of the Allied advance, and the traffic would be relayed back to Cairo. MERS was intercepting around 200 messages a day, just to give you an idea of scale, and they would be able to exploit around 3/4 of the total Aegean network for the German intelligence networks. And the chap on the left there is Ray Wright, who is still alive, lives in New Zealand. I managed to track him down, and he provided me with these photographs. Very, very secretive base, right in the centre of the military unit, and not many people knew what was going on behind the wire. In Gibraltar, another RSS facility was under the command of Captain Preston. It was one of the most active RSS units overseas. Had a lot of success in exploiting traffic, which was conveying ABVIR information into Allied shipping movements around the Straits of Gibraltar, and gave information around the ABVIR agents' traffic in Spain. Just to give you some further insight into how capable this service was, transmitted ABVIR messages could be intercepted, analysed, translated, decoded, and forwarded through to the Admiralty within 30 minutes of that being broadcast. Amazing stuff. The RSS also had units in the Far East. Special wireless sections were sent by sea to Singapore in January 1941. And were deployed to Kranji, which was a wireless station, Royal Naval wireless station. Others were deployed to Kuala Lumpur, and even one mobile unit was deployed to the Thai border. If you just flick to the next slide. But even in the Second World War, the Radio Security Service didn't avoid media scrutiny, and this is just a fairly interesting example from the Daily Mirror on the 14th of February 1941 that exposed the work of the Radio Security Service activity and the work of the Voluntary Interceptors around the country. It was quickly stamped on by the authorities, but it does go to show that media exposure of secret intelligence activity is not a new thing. So what became of the RSS? At the end of the war, a chap called Sir Finblatter Stewart did a wide sweeping review of MI5's structure and activity at the end of the war, and in November 1945 recommended the RSS elements should be retained, especially the RSS traffic analysis component, and he recommended it would move to the newly formed GCHQ at Eastcote in April 1946 when they were relocated there from Bletchley. And from then on, the traffic analysis components of GCHQ was really formed from the knowledge and experience of a lot of the instructors from the RSS in Barnet. And under agreement from the director, Edward Travis, the voluntary interceptor cadre would continue as well. It was decreased in number to 250, but the government communications voluntary radio service was then formed and would go on to see service with GCHQ during the Cold War. So the RSS, just to wrap up, what's important is just the understanding of they quickly owned the knowledge and information flows around the German intelligence service and other Axis intelligence service activities in occupied Europe and overseas. It's certainly been quoted over over a quarter of a million messages from the RSS were decrypted at Bletchley over the course of the war. The majority had been enciphered from Enigma machines, but nearly 100,000 of those messages were in hand cipher. But certainly the importance of target knowledge and traffic analysis really pioneered an approach which was taken forward after the Second World War. And that's probably all I wanted to say. If you just jump to the next slide. Thank you for listening to my talk. So that's an image of the book that was published in 2019. Yeah, I'll happily take any questions. Thank you for listening.
Well, thank you very much for that, David. There have been a number of questions that have come in. One or two actually were answered along the way. The first one was that when there was somebody, let's have a look, sorry. Yeah, so I'm afraid I'm not quite sure which slide this was, but there was who is in the uniform. Not quite sure. Sorry, I'm not quite sure which slide that was. But when you showed the slide of various, let's go back.
Yes,
I think,
the question was,
yes.
I think the man in the uniform.
Yeah,
I think you actually gave the name.
Yeah, that's a chap called Ray Fortley, who was one of the voluntary interceptors up near Leicester. I think he died a couple of years ago. But they, as I mentioned, they were given typically military uniforms as cover to obfuscate their activity doing work for the intelligence services.
Okay. There is then the slide where you've got various black boxes, and they seem to have, which I think are the German spy networks, these.
Yep.
And somebody has asked, what are the codes in the boxes?
Well, you've got the frequencies. So typically the four number, the four numbers are, or sequences are the high frequencies. The letters pertain to the identifier for where those networks are transmitting from. So they were giving typically trigraphs, and the A's and the B's and the D's, I think, were relating to the strength of the transmissions, because obviously with the vagaries of high frequency radio propagation, often the signals are very weak. Some of them are strong, depending on the way the ionosphere works during that day, and often certain networks transmissions were tended to be consistent. So there was always an explanation around the actual network charts, and fascinating, you can read quite a lot into them.
Okay. And what is Hanslope used for now?
Hanslope is owned by the Foreign Office, and it's still very, very involved in the communications business. So they, in terms of the embassies, the high commissions, the consulates around the world, and developing and maintaining the communications networks for the Foreign Office, or the FCDO as it's now called, the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office.
I think if I remember rightly, there was that controversy a couple of years ago where the various Hanslope files were released to the Public Record Office, which were various documents relating to emergencies in the post-1945 colonies, which had still been retained there.
Yep.
Somebody's asked how we can get a copy of the recording. Well, as we said at the beginning, it has been recorded, and it will appear in a couple of days' time through the Bucks Military Museum website. So if you keep your eye on that, then that will give you a link to the recording. And this is now on how extensive was Gambia Parry's involvement in the development of RSS?
That's a good question. He was.
How extensive was Gambia Parry's involvement in the development of RSS, or was this largely devolved to others on his staff?
Well, that's a good question. His involvement really didn't start until the SIS, the Secret Intelligence Service, or MI6, took the RSS on from 1941. In his role as the Controller for Special Communications, or CSC, he maintained oversight of all sorts of different communications apparatuses with places like Wadden, the special liaison units that deployed all over the world to transmit ultra intelligence. So he was involved. He was a very, very good leader for making sure the RSS got what it needed. But bear in mind, the organisation was formed before MI6 took it on. So the leadership layer, the commanders had already shaped the organisation before MI6 took it on.
Okay. And how did the operation at Wadden link in with the operation at Hanslope?
So the Wadden link was very much about. So Wadden had it was the SIS Section 8 headquarters, and they had a number of different remits. The most important one in the context of this conversation is the link to Bletchley Park. So they were responsible for relaying the output, the decrypted intelligence, to all corners of the world. So Wadden was significant for that, but the Hanslope Link was about the engineering support to that. There wasn't really a direct sort of intelligence flow or anything like that, but the engineering support was certainly there. They very much supported the development of the special communications units and the special liaison units that were deployed to support army and division and group level headquarters around the world. So take, for example, North Africa, Montgomery's headquarters, they would deploy as part of the headquarters these SLU teams that would be essentially truck-based interception units that would receive information from Wadden, and they were built at the with Wadden's the workshops around Wadden, and very much a lot of the personnel would have a good understanding of the RSS operation and the intelligence service activity. So.
Okay. I understand that good quality receivers were required for amateur listeners and were ordered in large numbers by the proverbial yesterday from an American company, National. They were called HRO, which stood for Hell of a Rushed Order. Is this true?
The HRO were very important receivers for the RSS, but they tended to be used at the fixed interception sites, like Forfar, like Gilnahirk, like Hanslope. The voluntary interceptors tended to rely on their own receiver sets that they would often built themselves, but the Eddistones as well, they were typically used. But the HROs are quite expensive. They were very, very good receivers, but they were very expensive, so they didn't get typically used by the voluntary interceptors around the country.
Okay, and this one, what was the source of the leak that resulted in February 1941 in the Daily Mirror? Was anybody prosecuted?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to it, and no, I don't think anybody was.
Okay, right, fine. Well, thank you very much for that, David. I will now hand over to Simon.
Well, David, thank you very much for that. I think for everybody, that was an absolutely fascinating talk, and the third in our series, which have been very widely received. And for everybody that's still listening, Wednesday the 13th of October is our next one, as on the screen. Hopefully we'll get that recorded as well. Could I ask everybody please to help us broadcast this? We have these wonderful speakers giving us really interesting high value lectures like David has just delivered, but we'd like to get more people aware of them. So if you have the opportunity in your network, please promote it for us. Similarly, we are on Facebook for those who are interested in Facebook. I appreciate that for some people you're not on Facebook for personal reasons, which is absolutely fine, but you can sign up to our website, and we can then keep you informed as to what's going on. And obviously this does cost us money. We do have a Just Giving site, and I'm very keen, please, to encourage you to give a donation to us all to help us lay on this caliber of presentation. And I can see lots of thanks coming in there, David, in the chat, and I would just echo that as well. And just finalize by saying, if you see on the screen there, that's the link there for the next lecture, and you've got all the links on there as well. This will be uploaded to www.bmmt.co.uk, our website, and you can follow us on Twitter as well. And thank you to Professor Ian Beckett, our On Secretary, and also thank you for Derek Plews, Lieutenant Colonel Derek Plews, our wonderful usherette, doing the slides tonight. And from myself, Lieutenant Colonel Simon Wilkinson, Chairman of Buckinghamshire Military Museum Trust, thank you all very much indeed for attending this evening.